My name is Kaaryn Gustafson. I am professor of law at UCI School of Law. I'm also co-director of the Center on Law, Equality, and Race, which is known as CLEAR. I want to thank you all for coming. Please know that this session is being recorded. Thanks to the many people who are joining us to mark Martin Luther King Jr. Day. Even bigger thanks to my colleagues who are offering their time and their thoughts at the end of a very busy first week of classes. In the last part of his life, Martin Luther King Jr. was deeply concerned with not merely political equality, but also material equality. Many people forget that the March on Washington was a march for jobs and freedom. Civil rights organizers in the 1960s were keenly aware that racial justice and economic justice are inseparable issues. In the years since, there have been questions repeatedly raised by scholars, activists, and thinkers of all sorts about what reparations would involve in the United States. There have also been questions about whether there are meaningful routes to reparations and what the consequences would be for a reparations program. In 2021, California established a task force to study and develop reparations proposals for African Americans. So there is now a reparations task force, and you can actually find out about those meetings by Googling the California Reparations Task Force. For this program, we have three distinguished speakers talking about reparations. I will do very brief introductions, after which our speakers will offer their thoughts. Our three speakers today are Mehrsa Baradaran. Professor Baradaran is a well-known author. She has her two notable books are How the Other Half Banks and The Color of Money, Black Banks and the Racial Wealth Gap. At UCI, she teaches courses on banking law, contracts, property, and housing, and she also teaches a course on law and racial capitalism. Our second speaker will be Jamelia Morgan, Assistant Professor of Law at UCI. She is an expert in race, gender, and disability. She has an amazing forthcoming article, but also a number of truly impressive past articles, and I look forward to her comments. And finally, we will be hearing from Bob Solomon. He is Distinguished Clinical Professor of Law here at UCI and co-director of the Community and Economic Development Clinic. He is also co-chair of UCI's Center for the Study of Cannabis. Professor Solomon does a lot of work on the ground and with the assistance of our students around community economic development. So we will begin with Professor Baradaran. After our three speakers present, I will open things up for questions. We do have a Q&A. You can go down to the bottom of your Zoom page and submit questions. Those questions will be can be seen only by the panelists, but I will read them out to everyone. So thank you again. Professor Baradaran.
Thank you. So during the summer of after we all watched the horrific video of George Floyd's murder, and many of us went on the streets to march, and I went out with my kids, and one of the chants spoken by protest groups is "No justice, no peace," and so we just kept repeating "No justice, no peace." And in the meantime, I was working on a testimony for reparations for both the California Reparations Task Force and the U.S. Congress. And so I was working at home, and as I was kind of intoning this chant and the march, it kind of just clicked for me. Why reparations, right? No justice, no peace. And if you look at, Martin Luther King's "I Have a Dream" speech, so I did write this up for the Prospect just that night. I came home and I was like, this is why justice has to be done. So in his "I Have a Dream" speech, Martin Luther King framed the Black American claim to justice as rooted in this broken promise. He says there's a promissory note to which, and as a banking person, I look at these things that bring up anything related to banks. So he says a promissory note to which every American was fall to air, a promise that all men would be guaranteed the unalienable rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. King said that America has defaulted on this promissory note insofar as her citizens of color are concerned. Instead of honoring the sacred obligation, America has given the Negro, he said, people a bad check, which has come back to mark insufficient funds. Continuing in the framing of a broken contractual obligation, he lays claim to a remedy. We've come to cash this check, a check that will give us upon demands the riches of freedom and the security of justice. No justice, no peace, right? He was referring to, of course, the promises made in the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment that had up until that point been violated over and over again, and not just violated, but added onto with, New Deal era exclusions, where if you look up where exactly George Floyd was murdered, it was a redlined area in Minneapolis. It was a banking desert, a food desert, low mobility ladders. That was a purposeful and purposefully racist mapping of risk across the United States that we have never directly remedied. So when we talk, I hope I have some contract students here. When we talk about contracts and we talk about contract breach, any promise, if you breach it, you pay damages. And there are various theories over hundreds of years developed of damages. We talk about restitution damages, unjust enrichment. We talk about reliance damages. We talk about expectancy damages, compensatory damages, any of those damages frameworks. The law knows how to do complex damages. We have, 9/11 funds, we have opiate funds. We know how to break down, and it's never enough. We know that you're never actually made whole. Damages are never fully paid because the harm usually way outweighs what you're ever going to get as far as justice is concerned, right? The traumas cannot be remedied, the deaths, the racism that still lives within us cannot be remedied. And so, but we know how to do that. That is in our law. And so it seems that until we do, we will not sort of meet the dream of our nation. And I think that there is, so the argument, I think, for giving reparations is pretty clear constitutionally. It's also very non-complicated, sort of structurally, monetarily. I think, as again, I was writing up how this might happen, the COVID fiscal response and the Fed came online, right? And so I was like, well, I'm trying to convince people that, look, there is money and we can do it. And all of a sudden, overnight, the Fed created trillions of dollars to send out into bond markets, into liquidity markets, money that just comes back into the Fed. And so the money is there, the practicality is there, the law is there. And I think just the last thing I will say, and the thing that Martin Luther King understood, and so did the people who, the majority of Americans who did vote along those lines at the time, understood that, even the founders, even Madison, who was a slave, a booster of slavery, called slavery America's original sin. C. Van Woodward, a historian of the South, explained how white supremacy and Jim Crow destroyed the soul of the South. Right? Racism destroys the soul of its perpetrators, even as it plunders the labor and the bodies of its victims. Frederick Douglass, in his memoir, talks about the white woman who purchased him and was ruined by slavery. He vividly writes about the costs to her of owning another human being. He talks about slavery proved as injurious to her as it did to me. I mean, I doubt it, but he says, when I went there, she was a pious, warm, and tender-hearted woman. She had bread for the hungry, clothes for the naked, and comfort for every mourner that came within her reach. Slavery soon proved its ability to divest her of those qualities. Under its influences, the tender heart became stone, and the lamb-like disposition gave way to one of tiger-like fierceness. She became red with rage. The voice made of kindness changed to one of harsh and horrid discord, and that her face turned into, sort of a kind of a master's face, and which he describes as a demon. So racism, its aiders, its abettors, its justifiers, the cops, the white moderates, as Martin Luther King would call them, are all of us are sick with this rot at the core of our democracy. And we've seen its many iterations on the video in our democracy, at the seizing of the Capitol. And it must be rooted out and addressed. It must be held out to the light. And that's what reparations does. That's what truth and reconciliation demands. And it must be examined honestly. It has to be dealt with properly. And not just for the sake of the people who it's harmed the most, but for the sake of the American soul. And so atoning for our country's original sin is sort of the way to have the peace and justice that the protesters have been demanding. So that's it.
Sorry, my mouse is having troubles. Thank you, Professor Baradaran. Professor Morgan, would you like to share your thoughts?
Sure. Thank you so much, Professor Gustafson, and to my terrific colleagues. It's really an honor to be here, certainly to honor Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., and also to engage in this very important conversation. I'm going to offer a few remarks to help us kind of frame some of these big questions that often come up in discussions of abolition: the what, the how, the why, so many of which Professor Baradaran has centered and discussed. And so I hope you'll bear with me for about 10 minutes or so as I go through some of the scholar, activists, and literature that has informed how I think about reparations, including anti-slavery abolitionists, civil rights activists, of course, Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King, and ongoing abolitionist organizing today. So how can we define reparations? Jordan Brewington, in Dismantling the Master's House, Reparations on the American Plantation, defines reparations as follows. Reparations are acts and processes of repair. They are grounded in the will to heal, to restore a people wounded, but not destroyed by intergenerational brutality and injustice. Reparationists seek accountability for historic injustices and call for the cessation of contemporary practices that perpetuate wrongdoings and persecute suppressed communities. Reparative acts are meant to give assurances to survivors that the injustices they have endured will not be repeated in the future. They will ultimately require the redistribution of power and efforts to leverage power, influence resources, ensure cessation, and non-repetition. Noted reparations scholars William Darity and Kirsten Mullen, in their book, which I do recommend, From Here to Equality: Reparations for Black Americans in the 21st Century, they define reparations as, quote, a program of acknowledgement, redress, and closure for a grievous injustice. Acknowledgement is the admission of wrong and the declaration of responsibility for restitution by the culpable parties. Redress is the act of restitution, compensation for the wrong, carried out by the culpable party. Closure is the settling of accounts between the victimized community and the culpable party, the arrival at conciliation. Similar to Brewington, Darity, and Mullen, abolitionist organizers and thinkers, Andrea Ritchie and Miriam Kaba, note a reparations framework includes 5 elements: repair, restoration, acknowledgement, cessation, and non-repetition of harm. There's different types of reparations, and these are centered in a number of national, local, grassroots campaigns. And I'm going to provide a taxonomy so we can kind of think not only about the what, but the different types of reparations that exist. There's economic reparations, there's a diversity of proposals ranging from individual cash payments to individual group administered funds. Why cash payments? Well, according to Darity and Kirsten Mullen, in our estimation, Black-white wealth inequality is the most powerful economic indicator of the full effects of racial injustice in the United States. Black Americans constitute 13% of the nation's population, but own less than 3% of the nation's wealth. Certainly, Mehrsa, your work has pointed to this as well. Of course, there are limits to individual cash payments. Mari Matsuda has long argued that the extent of racialized harms cannot be adequately compensated through cash payments, but still they should be centered and discussed in calls for reparation. Instead of cash payments, or in addition to, scholars like Catherine Franke, and of course, many of the abolitionist organizing that's happening in communities like River Road in Louisiana have called for a redistribution of land ownership as a form of racial repair. Beyond cash payments and land distribution, we've also seen calls for what Jordan Brewington terms narrative reparations. This includes public apologies, truth commissions, public memorials, and access to historic artifacts and records, as is again the movement in communities in Louisiana to obtain access to records about enslaved ancestors from many of the current occupants of the plantations there. Why do these forms of narrative reparations matter? Well, reshaping the narrative about slavery and its afterlives, the ongoing impacts of structural racism, affirms the humanity of descendants and the past and ongoing trauma that they have and continue to experience. Reshaping the narrative contextualizes structural racism, shifts the narrative from individualized explanations of inequality and marginalization, and indeed criminalization and violence, adverse health outcomes, to structural ones. It allows for a set of justifications to inform future reparations campaigns. And finally, it builds solidarity across communities. It recognizes the shared histories of oppression, the genealogies of racial oppression across racialized, negatively racialized groups. And finally, we can think about another type of reparation as systemic. This includes really a focus on shifting power back to communities and actively disrupting social hierarchies. Again, we can look to redistribution or land back campaigns, attempts to shift ownership from the current purveyors of what can be termed the plantation tourism industry, actual organizing right now in the South to attempt to acquire the proceeds from plantation tourism that takes place on current plantations in the South, redirect those funds to descendants of enslaved Black people who worked on those plantations, or Black laborers who were tied up in sharecropping or debt peonage agreements, worked on those plantations using legal instruments like eminent domain power. There's also different ways of thinking about reparations that center in the way that we define reparations. Compensation. Reparations can be paid at the individual or community level, either as in-kind or cash payments, or they can be distributed at the community level in the form of scholarships and trust funds, in-kind expenditures, commemorations, or museums. One example could be the Chicago Police Torture Victims Memorial, which is still yet unfunded, but many other reparations components of the reparations campaign have been implemented, again, by organizers, largely abolitionist organizers on the ground. So rehabilitative reparations, as Roy Brooks refers to, are designed to nurture the oppressed group's self-empowerment and community building, and achieve actual outcomes like closing the racial wealth gap. So we have both compensation or compensatory reparations and rehabilitative reparations. When we think about the administration of reparations, there's extensive work on how reparations should be paid out, how funds should be structured to ensure accountability and that fiduciary duties are adhered to. Darity and Mullen state quite frankly that they believe that reparations should come from the US, from the federal government, and that the government should pay given the government's complicity in structural racism. But others like Brewington again, and many organizers and abolitionists work on the ground today argue that descendants are central to a vision of reparations and argue for what can be termed local reparations. Again, I'm relying on Brewington's definition, which allow for institutions to, at the local level, identify the exact axes of white supremacy they perpetuate and developed a tailored policy of repair that, of course, incorporates the views of the descendants and engages them in power and decision-making authority in order to address the historical injustices. So local reparations facilitate the deeper work of identifying the harms caused by the evolution of the institution of slavery, pinpointing how every individual has been harmed by the system. So again, I've relied on scholars like Jordan Brewington and Roy Brooks Miriam Kaba and Andrea Ritchie to kind of articulate the contours of what is reparations, thinking about abolition and thinking about civil rights. But I want to finally close by thinking about what CRT, critical race theory, provides in terms of thinking about this ongoing movement and calls, demands, if you will, for reparations. So when we think about the various forms and models of reparations, which model, the kind of tort model that we're perhaps as lawyers more familiar with, compensating for individual injury, redress, or atonement, sort of looking at the narrative type reparations, the public apologies, the public memorials, and which type, economic, narrative, or structural, is more likely to gain buy-in from non-Black communities, just to again focus in on non-Black reparations, on Black reparations. So I'm relying, of course, on Derek Bell's famous interest convergence thesis, which states that racial reforms will only be permitted to the extent that these reforms align with white middle-class interests. We can see this, as Bell did, as potentially a barrier, as a cynicism that reflected Bell's belief in the permanence of racism. But we can also see it as a possibility. What interests can be surfaced to promote and prevent backlash? Possible interests, shifting the current forms of Southern tourism, if you will, away from the traditional plantation tourism to one that's rooted in addressing sort of the traumas, truth-telling that centers the actual histories of enslaved people in this country and their descendants, something akin to the work that Equal Justice Initiative is doing around the lynching memorials. Beyond reform, what models or types of reparations best promote mobilization to shift power? How can reparations ensure that there is indeed a shift in power through not only the administration of these funds, but through getting these laws passed in the first place? Could reparations frameworks include things like proportional representation in city councils, veto power, of course, in addition to, if not replacing, opportunities like cash transfers? Intersectionality. So intersectionality requires us to avoid erasures and recognize heightened vulnerabilities to state violence, poverty, predation, environmental racism, food insecurity within quote unquote Black communities, including trans Black communities, low-income Black communities, disabled Black communities. How would a viable reparations regime account for these multiply marginalized identity and status groups? And lastly, critical race theory backlash. So in the movement for Black Lives 2016 platform, advocates called for a quote, reparations for the cultural and educational exploitation, erasure, and extraction of our communities in the form of mandated public school curriculums. They sort of, in a very prescient way, were able to see the backlash to discussions of race and critical race theory in schools, really race, because I think as many of you, I see a few of my CRT students know, the current backlash is really not about the definition of critical race theory, at least as we know it. Backlash against the 1619 Project, equity, diversity, and inclusion initiatives, or really any discussion of the harms of racism in society. I think supporters of reparations campaigns should also focus in on resisting this backlash and these forms of resistance to truth-telling within our public schools as a part of any effort to obtain reparations in a local community, statewide or other. I also would plug the work of the African American Policy Forum that is working around the country to address this form of backlash. So I'll stop there and look forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Okay, please, Professor Solomon.
I will say that it is spectacular listening to Kaaryn and Mehrsa and Jamelia. It is less spectacular having to be the person who goes after them. But that said, it is a true joy to be here and to be able to talk about these issues. I want to start with some of the impediments that we hear as a regular basis. Jamelia or Mehrsa mentioned that the notion of slavery as America's original sin. Mitch McConnell says that. But then he then follows it up with, that was a long time ago. No one alive today did anything wrong. Both of those are fictions. It didn't happen a long time ago. It's still happening today. The results are certainly of redlining and housing policies and all kinds of other things. And many of us are beneficiaries of these policies. I certainly am one. And as my nature, I want to tell 3 short stories about how all this happens. One is the New York Life Insurance Company. You could also add Aetna and US Life as well. In the 1840s, when the New York Life Insurance Company was formed, they had a great idea to raise capital, and that was to insure the lives of slaves. Not life insurance as we think of it, but property insurance. This turned out to be pretty profitable initially. In the long run, it was not, but it enabled New York Life Insurance Company, now I think the 3rd largest or 2nd largest company in the country, to gain a foothold in the South, which was very important along the way. Second story, and all of Northern businesses were built on slavery and relations to slavery. You can go through anything from paper to crops to virtually every industry. And it's just the insurance industry is one we ignore a little bit. Second story is about 40 acres and a mule, the original really 40 acres. You've all heard this. We all understand this as being the first attempt to do something right after the war, to redistribute land. It's generally attributed to General Sherman. It is a field order from General Sherman, which was ultimately assigned by Abraham Lincoln. But there's something remarkable in how we got there. And that is that General Sherman did something that no one had done before. He went to 11 Black ministers, all men, in Georgia, in Savannah, and said, "What do you want? How can we protect your people as we go further?" And the group had some very specific ideas. We want land. We want to be able to till that land. We want self-government. And they were prescient enough to say the land should be on the barrier islands or on the coast, preferably the islands, to make it more difficult for whites to come and take the land, because they will try to do so. They will try to do so. And later, the mule was added, usually really use of government mules. And after Lincoln died, that was reversed. And of course, we then saw the KKK come in and that plan destroyed. The third story I want to tell is a very personal story about how all this works out. Mehrsa has written a lot about this. I was born in Newark, New Jersey. My father was a soldier in World War II. I was part of the largest birth class, 1947, almost 75 years ago, when everyone came back from the war. And one of the first things that my parents did is to move out of Newark. We were a Jewish family. There was a Jewish move from Newark, and first to rental housing, and then to a suburb in New Jersey, Teaneck, New Jersey. My father was able to purchase a house for $9,000, and he had zero money, no capital at all. He did have VA money. He had a loan from the VA administration as a veteran, and he was able to borrow a small down deposit from a life insurance policy provided by the Veterans Administration. In other words, with no money, he was able to do what any veteran could do. We lived in a small row house, not a wealthy part of town by any means, and 5 of the 6 of those row houses were occupied by Jewish families. Took me about 30 years to understand what all that meant. My elementary school was all white, but about 1/3 Jewish. So that meant that this was a place that was pretty much limited to white buyers, but it was also a place where Jews were allowed to move in, and that created a very particular community. That led to me going to a school where a junior high and a high school where most of my college, 90%, I think 95% of my high school went to college. The odd part about all of that is that Black soldiers did not have that opportunity. Black soldiers could not have bought into that neighborhood. The VA would not have allowed it. Redlining would not have allowed it. And that has continued up until present times. Housing patterns mean a lot. And so we continue those kinds of patterns, and we continue to have beneficiaries. And my father, Yogi Berra, said, when you come to the fork in the road, take it. My father took it. It was only, he had a choice of where to go. Other people did not have a choice. And that's a continuation of the kind of harms that we have talked about over the years. It is hard, as Jamelia pointed out, figuring out how to quantify and where to start. My own views are, I'm not content with starting with a cash payout, because I think what will happen is what will happen with Japanese internment reparations, which was you end up with a lump sum number and divide it up, and it's too small. It is nice to get a lump sum of $20,000, but it is not going to make the kind of changes that we need. So I like to go back to 40 acres or 40 acres and a mule and see what was the intent and how do we recreate that intent. Well, the real intent was to create a home, a safe home, employment, maybe subsistence, but sufficient employment and enough to create generational wealth, because land creates generational wealth. The other way we create generational wealth is through education. So I think to start with, universal preschool is just a no-brainer. We know that the best dollars that we can put into the school system is for a high-quality equal preschool, not particularly expensive. All this money will add up in the end, but something that should be available to everyone. And we know right now we are creating a system where low-income people, particularly people of color, are in a situation where children are entering kindergarten at a tremendous disadvantage. We also know if you do not start reversing that advantage by disadvantage by 6.5 years of age, you run into reading problems and you run into permanent problems. Can't let that happen. We know how to reverse it. We should. We should also do the same thing for higher education, and we should really be emphasizing state schools, land grant schools, community colleges, the schools that really make a difference in moving people up the economic ladder. Yale, Harvard, Stanford do not really need the help of the federal government or the tax code, yet the tax code helps those schools more than it helps anyone else. I'll get to that in 1 second, but first I want to get to housing. We have a housing program, Section 8, which is a tenant subsidy program, in which we spend very little money compared to what we spend for the overall federal budget. We do not allow it to be used for ownership except in very limited circumstances. We need to change that. We need to make it so that the federal government is contributing to home ownership for eligible people, and that should be part of a reparations plan. It should be pretty liberal, and that's not going to be enough money. So we should add that the federal government or state governments, but it's going to be, as Jamelia pointed out, largely federal government funds, should take a soft second mortgage. In other words, the federal government should take an equity provision in housing for people who couldn't otherwise afford their home. And how will this be paid off for people who don't have adequate money? By time. One easy way is to say every year 10% of your mortgage will be paid off. If you live there 10 years, you will now have built up equity. You want to make it 20 years, it's okay with me, but allow it to be intergenerational. Allow people to buy in wealthy neighborhoods with government subsidies where over time it becomes a real ownership issue. Right now, we have 90% of affordable housing is built through the low-income housing tax credit. In other words, we're giving rich people a tax subsidy in order to build affordable housing. It's not that terrible because it does result in affordable housing being built. It's all rental. We need to give the same incentives to the same builders to do home ownership and then tie it together with lending programs. The program's in place. It'll work. We know it will work. Does it mean more tax expenditures? Yes. It's worth mentioning what a tax expenditure is. It's what we used to call tax credits. It's money that the federal government doesn't get. It's the same as spending money, except it's a very cute way for Congress to pass policies favoring the wealthy without actually giving the wealthy money. Instead, the wealthy pay less taxes. We are currently having a tax expenditure, meaning money that the federal government does not receive in taxes, of $1.4 trillion a year. 1.4 trillion, 8 billion of that goes for the low-income housing tax credit to build affordable housing. In other words, if you see a dime on the street and don't think it's worth picking up, that's what we're putting into affordable housing. And so funds are there. We currently have a policy where people are giving their charitable contributions for things like a $60,000 high school football stadium in Texas. I am sure it's a great stadium. I wouldn't mind seeing it, having a hot dog. I don't want my federal government paying for it. That's letting an individual set public policy well beyond what should be done. Most of the educational grants that are given through charitable contributions are going to Yale to build the theater, Harvard, Stanford, continue guessing. They are not going to historic Black universities, not going to community schools, not going to the places that make a difference. Finally, I do want to say something about cannabis for a couple reasons. The absolute no-brainer is we have a 50-year policy based on a system that is racial. It's overwhelmingly racial. Both liberals and conservatives agree it's a failure. And the notion that people are still in jail or have a record of a conviction is ridiculous. We need to have that change immediately. And we need to clean up records, and it should not require any action by someone with a conviction. It's government function. Let's get it done. Perhaps equally or even more important, it's rare that we have new industry where there is going to be so much capital put in and ultimately so much profit. And we talk about equity. We talk about doing something for communities in which that have suffered over the past 50 years or even longer. We're not too good at it. Both California and New York have equity provisions for new businesses. LA and San Francisco have been dismal at making it work. We need ways to bring capital. We need partnership. We need to put a limitation on people with capital coming in, to require partnerships, to require investments in communities. And the final thing is, both in housing and education and in cannabis, we have local control. We have bad zoning laws and it's zoning out cannabis as well as housing, zoning out multiple unit housing. All of that requires political will by states, by federal government. This is all ways of separating races, separating incomes. Concentration of poverty is part of concentration of race, and we have been doing it since before the Civil War, and we continue to do it. We need to change all of that.
Okay. Thank you very, very much, all of you. So a reminder to folks in the audience, we do have a Q&A. If you go down to the bottom of your Zoom window, there is a Q&A icon. You can submit questions. I am going to read a question that has been submitted. It says, I appreciate Professor Solomon providing very specific ideas for reparations, which are likely to have a big impact on many Black Americans. However, will improved education and housing feel like reparations to Black Americans that have borne generations of racist laws and regulations?
Yeah, I'm probably the worst person to answer that.
I'll leave that open to anybody who's here.
I'm the white guy from New Jersey. I propose plans that I think will work, but I am still the white guy from New Jersey.
Okay. Would anyone else like to speak to that?
I'll provide thoughts, just again, informed by the organizing that's happening in communities, which I think is rather inspiring to the extent that we think reparations are sort of a far off goal. There are a number of groups that are actively seeking and have won at the kind of local level successful campaigns for reparations. So I'm going to talk about the Chicago Torture Justice Memorials. I referenced some of their work, and when I'm done speaking, I'll include a link to the work that they've been doing. So one of the things that is central in a lot of the organizing, particularly at the local level within abolitionist spaces, is this idea of atonement. So Roy Brooks refers to this as the atonement model of reparations, which seeks to not only think about specific proposals, of which Professor Solomon, you aptly laid out and set forth, but the atonement model is forward-looking and it's responsive to trauma, and it seeks healing in the process of truth-telling and reconciliation, right? And we have, of course, international law, human rights, and work. I'm thinking of the South African context where this has been developed and operationalized, although there's limits there as well, and I can point to literature on that for those that are interested, but there are particular elements that need to be included. And I think that's what the question is getting at. What does racial reconciliation look like? It looks like a recognition and atonement for the harms that happened. And it might be on an individualized level. Like we have templates for that. I think of some of the work that Ken Feinberg did in implementing the 9/11 fund. Like he allowed survivors and survivors of those that were lost in that incident to speak about what they were experiencing as a part of the process for obtaining compensation. Now that is a tort model. It's less focused in on kind of reparations and atonement, as I think the kind of radical thinking around reparations and reform thinking around reparations is. But forgiveness has to be a part of it. And that's why I think the public apology, the truth and reconciliation processes do matter and can be a complement to, again, some of these specific proposals that are about shifting resources and power to Black communities that have been impacted by slavery and its afterlives.
Yeah, I do want to add that, some of you probably read that Santa Monica recently has a program for housing loans and subsidies. The LA Times reported it as an act of civic penance. I think that's important. We're terrible as a country and coming together, coming to grips with our history. And so I really do think truth and reconciliation for all of us is a critical first step. And of course, we're seeing that any mention of teaching real history has a tremendous pushback.
Yeah, and I would say that the lesson of history is, twofold. One is that a lot of the time, one is that this is not a new conversation. I think, with the 40 acres and a mule, with, Frederick Douglass, Martin Luther King, W.E.B. Du Bois, Carter Woodson, every Black leader over time, and from the beginning, of the first slave ship coming, there's always been a struggle for not just freedom, but also repair. And those struggles have failed, quite honestly. The civil rights movement was very much about, as Kaaryn started this talk, was about economic justice remedies to that. And Johnson got really close, but didn't quite make it. And so I think one of the things is that there are a lot of models. I think the thing that goes wrong is when it is not directed by the community itself. And so part of the demand for land was a demand for participation in the democracy that was tied to land. So I think Frederick Douglass and the Reconstruction, during Reconstruction, Black leaders understood that if they lost their land, they would lose their rights, political rights. And so if you don't have land, if you don't have political rights, you don't have the vote, then the rule of law doesn't protect any land that you can accrue. So it's not just that they didn't get the 40 acres and a mule, it's that for the next 100 years, if a Black man got land and a white mob wanted to lynch him for getting the land, if he got a patent right, if he got and it's all he, I mean, it was, their gender was not quite inclusive yet, but if he got any sort of power, or if you built a whole Black Wall Street, they would come and the law would not protect you against the vigilante violence. And so I think that it's integrative. And I think that what history shows is that racism and discrimination and the plunder of the Black community didn't happen at once and through one institution. So it's not just education or housing or credit, or, I mean, we can, there are multiple fields, taxation, any field you go down to, you go 3 layers deep, and then there's a racist code that kind of supports the entire superstructure. And so I would think that a reparations program would be, and President Biden actually in one speech on race, he says it should be the business of the federal government, the entire federal government. I would say state and local. And this is not to say that this is the only thing, but every organization knows where the bones are buried in their own organization. The Treasury supported the Freedmen's Bank. The Fed has supported FHA, lending for years and years. The Department of Education. I mean, they know what they did. They know their own history. There is a historian and a documentarian for every single institution. And so it does have to be across the board. And so I think there's a temptation with reparations discussions to go right down to the practicalities because they do seem insuperable. But the US maintained a system of racial domination for hundreds of years. And that was, complicated. And so I think that the first conversation is to find the political will. And I think that insofar as that's missing, the practicalities are never going to be fixed. But once that's there, the practicalities go away. The details actually are irrelevant because we'll figure it out. I mean, we figured out, like Bob said, the Jewish community, the Italian community, the Irish community were not white. They were heavily discriminated against. They were put also in sort of racial ghettos. And post-World War II, policymakers decided not to do that. I don't know if that's a positive story about how policy can shape the hearts and minds of people toward other races. But it did happen. And over a generation, those real, obviously anti-Semitism isn't gone. But there was a way that those racial ghettos did disappear almost overnight. In a decade.
Okay, we have some more questions. The next question is, the discussion of legal impediments and therefore opportunities to addressing racial inequity leaves out some current zoning and housing policies at the state and local level. For example, California's Prop 13 created a class of usually white winners, and zoning prohibits denser developments. Just look at Irvine. Is that part of the equation or too far outside the remit of reparations? Bob, would you like to take that?
It's absolutely part of the equation. Zoning is a major way in which we have segregated communities. And to the extent that we have subsidized rental housing, as soon as we say it's 1 acre zoning, we are saying no one can afford a rental. As soon as we say we are only having single family housing, we are saying you have to be wealthy to buy into that. And you will not be able to use a rental voucher because there's nowhere to rent. A few times I've been on the radio on shows on homelessness, and one question that comes every time is that my community is issuing Section 8 vouchers, but they're using very few of them. Is that because they're discriminating? And the answer is no, that's because your zoning is discriminating, and there aren't enough rental units, and the people with the vouchers have a piece of paper that's really not worth very much. And so we need to change that. The problem to me is local control. Local control, I've practiced law in 3 states, and every state has strong local control, which means that we have very few places where people can live. At one point, when I worked on an urban mapping program in Connecticut, we looked at who had vouchers and where they were able to use the vouchers, and we did mapping over the places that were getting the most complaints about housing code enforcement. and the maps are overlapped. In other words, you can only use your voucher in the worst part of town, because if you're a slumlord, you're delighted to have a Section 8 voucher because you're going to be able to collect more rent than you would otherwise. There's very little enforcement by this at the federal level. But largely, when we allow local zoning codes and we put no pressure from the state or the federal government, we are excluding people.
So I think there's a little bit of a follow-up I'd like to ask to that question that I think might be of interest to all three of you. And, we're talking about different levels of government. There's a big question of whether federalism has always been a harm to African Americans. And there's this tension between control among communities over the resources that might happen through reparations, but political will at different levels to provide that. And so I think one of the follow-up questions is, would an effective reparations program have to come from the federal government?
Depends how you define effective. We could have a state government program that's effective in California, but it's not going to be effective in Texas.
The reason that the federal government is usually the place we go is because the federal government has the mint. They have the money. They have the power to print money, and the states do not. So to the extent that states are giving back property, that's all great. But again, like the scale of the theft, whatever you want to call it, the scale of the plunder, it can only be something that the federal government can remedy. And so usually when it's big things like that, even when there's like a disaster in a single state and FEMA comes, there's a treasury backstop, and the FDIC fund goes into the red, there's a treasury backstop. And the treasury backstop things because they can make money. And they've done so very easily. We are at the cheapest, maybe not, going forward, but it's just much easier for the federal government to do it. But of course, these state projects are also necessary because, as Bob said, and as the first question on zoning says, zoning is very much a local issue. And zoning, if you look at the Euclid case in the Supreme Court, I teach it in property, that case was decided because the justices believed that apartment buildings and the people who resided in them, coded as people of color and immigrants, black people, of course, were a nuisance, were blight, were a harm to the safety of white children in single family homes. And so these decisions were built upon like a eugenicist understanding of children and people who lived in smaller houses. And so that's a racist law. It's racist from the core of it. The roots of it were racist. And so I think, yes, that is definitely part of it.
The one thing I would add is just in some of the early theorizing, just to again refer back to the scholar that I referenced, Jordan Brewington, in the Yale Law Journal. That article talks about eminent domain and the use of eminent domain to redistribute land ownership. And it's certainly a radical approach. And I think that would allow for, especially given like the Supreme Court's Kalo decision, and I think it's the Midkiff decision. I'm not a property law scholar, but again, and I haven't looked at the contours of that argument, but it does at least allow for states some leeway in redistributing land. And I think that if we look to sort of Native Hawaiians and their movement to try to reclaim land for Indigenous Hawaiians, we can see the use of, again, policies at the state level to allow for that redistribution. So again, just to allude to a set of devices, that the state can engage in.
You're on mute, Kaaryn.
You're on mute.
We only have 5 minutes, so I'm selecting some of the questions. One is, can anyone comment on what role state and federal courts should or could play in enabling reparations programs to take hold? Conversely, are there ways in which courts have impeded or might impede reparations movements?
Well, should and could are very different. courts have not been great on housing zoning cases. We have had some Supreme Court cases during the Warren years, which broke down some barriers like restrictive covenants, but did very little in any affirmative requirements. So what courts should do, to me, would start with the voting cases, for one thing, are important. The gerrymandering cases are important. Breaking down, state Supreme Courts could break down local controls pretty quickly and do not. All of those things are pretty important. If we had some situation of the federal or state government taking land by eminent domain for the purpose of reparations or even desegregation, we're going to see a lot of lawsuits. And I would not be surprised if the current Supreme Court finds that to be an unconstitutional taking. And so, when people say the federal courts, because they have the feds have all the money, state courts have separate constitutions. And Ohio yesterday or today found the gerrymandering in Ohio to be unconstitutional under Ohio law. And it's almost certain that the Supreme Court would not touch it. So we do have a complicated system.
Yeah, I'll just add, I wanted to include the link to the Randall case. I don't know if you all have been following the litigation in state court seeking reparations for the Tulsa race riots in 1920, 1921. Indeed, the named plaintiff, Ms. Randall, was 107 this year and waiting for a court decision on the complaint, and in response, an opinion on the defendant's motion to dismiss. So I'll include that. There is a role for courts, but in terms of kind of litigation, the use of litigation to seek reparations, there's not that many cases. And so I think that's an open question. But of course, we're dealing with doctrine and how courts will interpret it, the politics of the Supreme Court, and where we are in terms of the judiciary and the move rightward. I think these are all complicated and sort of questions that or responses to which look sort of daunting in general, kind of given the political landscape.
And to add to that, courts in many cases will say there is a statute of limitations. It has long passed. Statute of limitations is just a legal construct, which often is to create a just situation for a defendant. There is no just defendant in this case. This is a public policy issue.
We are down to 1 minute, but I'd like to pose just one more question, which has to do with the issue Jamelia Morgan raised about interest convergence. Now, some of the proposals that have come out of this discussion have been more universalistic, which would mean they would be more appealing to voters across the racial spectrum. Universal pre-K is probably one of those. And others that are specific, especially directed benefits to people who can trace back their lineage to people who were enslaved, that would probably pose more resistance. Given the spectrum, if we have a limited range of options, where do we go?
I always have the least resistance to silence. I actually would start with people who could trace their lineage back, because it's going to inevitably be a limited pot. And I think that that's the most important population to serve first, although I would also include Indigenous people who have been treated equally poorly.
I think my instinct with all of this is to be over-inclusive rather than under-inclusive, to just aim at closing the racial wealth gap. And if you accidentally end up, benefiting some, immigrants or other communities that happen to live in those areas where you want to get the gap up, then that's okay. But I do think that targeting it to sort of outcome-oriented measures, like we know how vast the racial wealth gap is, and so getting sort of the outcome measured properly, then backing into it, I think provides some good avenues.
Okay. Well, thank you all for participating. Thank you, everyone who joined the webinar, and I hope everyone has a healthy and reflective Martin Luther King Jr. weekend. Take care.